Hey everyone. Today we'll talk about source evaluation or evaluating sources. So the research process requires that we find sources to use that support our own arguments, that support our own opinions or thesis, and so on. So we want to think about a source as any type of published material that's used as research or reference material. So anything you find that you mean to use for supporting your argument or your thesis will count as a type of source. So when we say any type of material, we mean that quite literally. It could be a book, it could be an academic article, a newspaper article, a magazine article, a documentary, an interview, and so on. There's really many different ways and types of sources that we can use in our research. So source evaluation really is all about evaluating the sources to determine what their worth is in relation to the argument that we're making. We don't want to use just any source we find. We rather want to use sources that are more reputable and will actually give us good information to support our claims. So there are really three major types of sources that we want to be aware of and want to use as part of our research process. The first of these are academic sources. Academic sources are meant to reveal new information about advanced scholarly topics, and these academic sources are targeted more towards other scholars within that same subject area. Most commonly, we see these as books and journal articles. Public sources are a little bit different in that they reveal information about multiple topics for information, for entertainment, for persuasion, other purposes. We see public sources pretty commonly in day-to-day life. These can be books about any variety of topics. They can be magazines, newspapers, television shows and commercials. Any type of advertising would qualify as a public source. Internet sources are a bit different from public and academic sources, largely in how we consume that information. Internet sources reveal information about multiple topics for many different purposes. Like with public sources, internet sources can inform, entertain, persuade, argue. Very often we see internet sources that are meant to sell things. Internet sources are always some type of website. And one thing to be constantly aware of in regards to internet sources is that they can vary in quality from surprisingly good to extraordinarily bad. So we need to have some extra criteria to evaluate all different types of sources with, and especially internet sources. There are a number of different things that we can look for to help us identify reputable sources, identify sources that will be helpful to us. The first of these is the publication process. The publication process and information about the publication process helps us to determine and differentiate good sources from not so good sources. Academic sources and academic publications are peer-reviewed and edited. Peer-reviewed academic sources are peer-reviewed in mainly the same way that we think of peer review. When we are submitting our own work for peer review, this simply means our classmates are reviewing our work for any kinds of problems in logic, grammar, format, quality, and so on. So academic sources go through the same process. Academic sources go through this process to help eliminate any kind of inaccuracy in the information, any kind of unfair bias in the subject, and so on. Academic sources are also edited. The editing process involves finding any errors and correcting any errors, from large concept type errors to small errors involving grammar and so on. The end result of this peer review and editing process is a source that is accurate, that is reliable, and largely will be an appropriate source to use so long as it matches your topic. Professional publications have a similar process in that they're edited, but very often are not peer-reviewed. This means that while professional sources do use an editor, the source, the article or the book or what have you, will be edited, but is not reviewed by peers to help eliminate any kind of unfair bias or anything like that. One of the problems with this is that very often professional sources are subject to the biases of the editor. So while the author may not be biased, the editor may be, and may encourage the author to include a certain bias in that source. Internet sources are an entirely different matter, however. For many internet sources, there's no required editing or peer reviewing process that's required. Some internet sources may be edited and or peer reviewed, but to be published, there is no actual requirement for that. Sources like personal websites, blogs, and so on have no editor beyond the author. Some other sources like Wikipedia or more reputable web sources like National Geographic do have an editing process and may or may not have a peer review process. We also want to pay particular attention to the authorship of the source and any affiliations that author may have. Academic sources always reveal the author's background is often included as well. This usually means that in an academic source, we will see the author's name, any kind of contact information in some cases, any kind of professional experience such as where they teach or what area that the author teaches in, maybe a brief publication history as well. That's pretty common information to see in academic sources. Professional publications will usually, that's the key word there, usually reveal the author of the source, whereas internet sources often do not reveal the author. Well, academic sources will usually reveal any kind of author affiliations by means of mentioning the university or college or school for which the author teaches. Professional publications and internet publications generally do not. Professional publications, when they do reveal the author, usually will not describe any particular background the author has. They may not. It depends largely. However, you generally will not see any information regarding the author's, for example, political biases or so on. Internet sources, since generally they do not reveal authors, kind of leave you in the dark, as it were, regarding the authors, any affiliations they may have. With professional publications, we can safely assume that whatever agendas the publisher has, the author of that publication will have that agenda as well. Internet sources, largely there's no way to tell. We also want to pay particular attention to the sources and quotations any source uses. So in our own writing, in our own arguments, we use sources to support our writing, our claims, our argument. Well, other publications are no different. Other articles or books that are written, they use sources as well. So we want to verify some information in relation to that. Academic sources always reveal all of the research that the author used while writing that source. So we also include publication information in that source information. So at the end of any type of academic source, you will find a works cited page, a bibliography page, a reference page, sometimes combinations of all of those things. The main point is that you can look in that bibliography or works cited page to find all of the research the author used. Many professional publications rarely reveal direct research citations, but may give the name of any authors or interviews they conduct. So, very rarely will you see a works cited page at the end of a magazine article. That usually doesn't happen. However, during the course of the article itself, we may see the author citing Dr. Jones states that blah blah blah. And while Dr. Jones may or may not be a real person, well, we're left to assume that it is. So that's something we always want to check back on. If a professional source indicates some kind of interview or some kind of authority from which they get information, we might want to double check that. Internet sources have a pretty bad reputation in that they often do not reveal their own research or their own citations or where they got their information from. And again, largely this will depend on the reputability of the publisher, but for the most part, sources like personal websites or blogs generally may not reveal that kind of information. We always want to look for any kind of obvious bias or any kind of appellation to any special interest on the author or source's part. In academic writing, the editing and peer review process removes what we'll call unfair bias from most academic sources. There is a distinction, however, that we need to make between what we call unfair bias and fair bias. In academic writing and argumentative writing, bias is an integral part of that. We are taking a position, we're defending that position throughout our work. So to that end, there always will be some level of personal bias that we exert on that. Fair bias is bias that we make obvious, but still support with evidence. Unfair bias will often make claims about any number of subjects, but will not appropriately support them with research, with evidence, with logical explanations. Professional publications generally attempt to avoid appealing to special interests, largely because they want to avoid alienating potential customers. We remember professional publications are a profit-generating venture, so if that publication appears to take too large of a bias or appeal to any particular special interest more so than another, the risk is that the publication alienates customers and thereby reduces their profits. So for the large part, we see professional publications avoiding special interests, or at least obvious special interests. But on the other hand, another important factor to consider is the influence advertisers have on the professional publication process. We largely think of things like magazines as something that is supported by subscription fees. That's actually a very, very small part of that publication's revenue and income. Advertisers pay the vast majority of the publication's bills, and the publication gets the vast majority of its profits from the advertisers. To that end, advertisers may have an unfair influence on the material and content of that source. So we want to be aware of and look for any evidence of that. Internet sources are often heavily biased. The internet has no publication process and has no requirements for authorship, so anyone can publish anything at any time. That's the key thing to be aware of. You don't have to know what you're writing about or what you're claiming. You can just publish it. So as we're reading through internet sources, we want to pay particular attention to any kind of appeal to special interests that may unfairly skew information in a bad way. We also want to look for any particular evidence of unfair bias. We also want to be aware of how qualified the author is to speak on the subject on which they're speaking. For the most part, academic sources require one of two things: advanced degrees in the area in which the author is writing, or if not an advanced degree, at least significant professional experience from their authors. So if you are reading an article in an academic journal about Shakespeare, then you can safely assume that the author of that article has spent their entire career studying Shakespeare. If you read an article about brain surgery, then you can safely assume that the article was written by a brain surgeon or a neurologist or a neurosurgeon or what have you. Now, there's a pretty significant difference between author qualifications in regards to academic sources and professional sources. Authors of professional sources are very often experienced writers. That's not usually the problem. The problem is that the authors of professional sources, while they are experienced writers, don't necessarily have direct experience in the field in which they do write. Now, what this means is that we may have a journalist who has spent an entire career writing about business practices, but that's fine. They may be very aware of what goes on in business, how business works, and so on, but the problem is they are a career writer, not a career business person. So while they may be familiar with business, they may not know how business actually works. Internet sources, however, have no requirements for authors. Professional sources will require of their authors degrees or experience in writing or professional experience in the field. However, internet sources have no requirements whatsoever, so anyone can publish anything. I could very easily write a large article about brain surgery, but I've never conducted brain surgery, I've never had brain surgery, I've never read anything about brain surgery, I don't know anything about it. But the way internet publication works is that I don't have to. I can just write whatever I want and post it on my blog, and it would be there for anyone to use. So be aware of that as you're reviewing sources. We also want to be aware of any kind of publication information in relation to that source. Academic sources will always reveal all of their publication information. Publication information applies to things like author, the date, the publisher, and so on. Professional publications and academic publications are very similar in this regard in that professional publications always reveal the date on which that source is published, but may or may not reveal the author. More often the author is revealed than not, but something to be aware of. Internet sources, however, are a bit different. The extent to which an internet source reveals its publication information will depend largely on the publisher. Now, in some cases, such as blogs, even if we have an author who has no experience in the area, no qualifications, knows nothing about it, we can still at least see when it was published, largely just for the date feature that blogs often have. Some websites may or may not include the publication date, so be aware of that. We want to be aware of how old or who wrote or who published any particular source, mainly because we want to know how old that source is, how new it is. So far, we have looked for or have seen a number of different things to consider as we are reading our sources, as we're evaluating. But now, let's look at some exact questions that we can ask and what those questions mean. We always want to question the authority of any piece that we read. So there's some questions we want to ask. Is the author clearly identified? What are his or her credentials? So if the author is not identified, we want to ask why. And if the author is identified but the credentials are not, then we want to ask why. So we also want to ask, is the author affiliated with any particular organization, and if so, what is that organization's reputation? So the main reason we want to ask this question is because some certain organizations, especially special interest groups, tend to work less with fact and more with appeal. So a special interest group may be more comfortable with skewing or stretching or massaging the truth than an academic journal would. So keep that in mind. So we also want to think, does the author of the source offer contact information for either the author or the publisher? Academic sources generally have some kind of direct way to contact the author, very often in form of an email address, and that's there to invite discussion about the topic you just read about. Professional sources often as well have some kind of contact information, and this is especially true of newspapers and magazines. You'll often see the author's email address attached to their miniature biography or so on. And again, that's there to initiate conversation. We also want to question a source's purpose and a source's coverage. So the first question we want to ask of any source is, well, are the purposes and objectives of the source made clear? So if not, well, let's talk about purpose for a second. We know purpose is a one-word answer. We write to inform, to persuade, to entertain, to argue, and so on. So what we want to ask is, if a source is argumentative or persuasive, is it clear that that source is argumentative or persuasive throughout the duration? Or does the source begin as a educational piece, but later on in the end try to sell you something? Well, that can usually be problematic for a number of different reasons, largely in that we can't necessarily trust the information of a source that's trying to sell you something. So we also want to think, is the publication meant for audiences of a specific specialization? What does the audience do for a living? And how adept are they at that? Is the source written for experienced doctors or first-year medical students? Is the source written for a particular gender? Is it a men's publication or a women's publication? Does a source appeal to a certain region? Largely, we won't see very many farming-oriented sources in New York City because, well, you don't see a lot of people farming in downtown Manhattan. It just doesn't happen. We also want to think about any particular time periods as well. So we also want to think about how comprehensive that source is. So does the source provide a comprehensive view of the subject matter? This just means, does the author provide as much information as they possibly can on the entire subject, or does the author provide very little information on a very specific point about the subject? One of the most important things that we can take into consideration is a source's accuracy. If a source doesn't meet all the criteria of anything else but meets the criteria of accuracy, well, that's a pretty good thing going for it. So one of the questions we want to ask is the source part of a peer-reviewed or edited publication? If so, this means that if a source is peer-reviewed, then we can safely assume that that source has lost any unfair bias that it had. The version we're reading is free of unfair bias and largely of errors. Sources that are not peer-reviewed or edited, well, we want to start questioning the sources and start double-checking. So, does the source present problems as simple or complex? We take a problem like global warming, And many of the sources that we may find in relation to that subject may present the phenomenon as a simple problem. Well, I say, well, it's entirely caused by pollution, or it's entirely caused by natural occurrences. Well, it's really, global warming is a problem that's not just simple. It's a very complex problem. There's a number of different factors that go into that. So we want to question the accuracy of any source that would attempt to make a complex problem appear to be simple. And finally, these two questions here are kind of related. Can any claims, research, factual information be verified? Well, if an author cites another author or another source or another piece of research, is there any way for you to find that other author, source, or piece of research? And finally, based on what you already know about the subject, does it seem accurate? Does it just seem wrong? If you're reading through a source and find that something just doesn't quite feel right, double check the facts. You might be surprised with what you find. Furthermore, we want to question any source's timeliness. So the first question to ask of it, when was the source published, and or when was it most recently updated? Recently updated largely applies to web sources, but does also apply to textbook type sources. So if a source is published in, let's say, 1990, so I don't know, what do we think? Would that source be usable? Well, the answers to that will depend on when the research was conducted and also what the subject is. Is that modern or current given the state of the subject? So we take, for example, an article written about Ernest Hemingway. So that article was written, let's say, back in 1970, and it's considered the best article written about Hemingway ever. So we also have another article, let's say this one was published in 1993. Now this 1993 published article is about the most amazing advances in computer technology. The question to ask is, well, which one of these is going to be the most timely or the most current source? The answer to that question will be the Hemingway article, because the Hemingway source material hasn't changed. Computers in 1993 are by no means what they are today. Technology changes rapidly and constantly, so we need to be aware of that. And it's for that reason that we always generally want to use the most current sources available to us. We also want to question any source's objectivity. We want to question if the source is unfairly biased. We just talked a little while ago about unfair bias. And unfair bias simply refers to, well, does the source present a bias that's not supported by evidence? That's an unfair bias. And in that case of bias, does the source use any kind of inflammatory or provocative language instead of facts and reasoning? Sources that use inflammatory or provocative language instead of facts and reasoning tend to be less accurate. They're based on emotion rather than reason. So if the source contains advertising, we also want to question any conflict of interest that might appear between the content and the advertising. And we'll take this example. There we find an article that describes all of the amazing benefits of smoking. Well, we do some background research and check into the author and see that the author is employed by Philip Morris Tobacco Company. That's a conflict of interest. Philip Morris Tobacco Company is paying this author to publish an article that explains how great smoking and cigarettes are. So we want to consider that kind of problem, that kind of conflict of interest. And this is popping up more and more commonly, especially with web sources. Are the advertisements distinguishable from the content of the source itself? This problem pops up based on how publishers are compensated by advertisers in terms of web sources. largely publishers are paid based on how many users click on the advertisements within their page. So a kind of sneaky tactic that many publishers have begun utilizing, well, for web sources, is attempting to make the advertisements look very similar, if not the same, to their own published material. The idea is that it will mislead you into clicking on the advertisement, and you clicking on the advertisement means they get paid. So we want to be aware of and avoid those kinds of problems. So we now have a bunch of different questions to ask and what those questions mean. Well, what we do with the answers will depend entirely on what your goals are. If you're using or looking for information to support your own claims, we want to use reliable sources. We don't want to use sources that have questionable authorship, that have inaccurate information, and so on. However, if we're trying to disprove or rebut an opposing argument, well, less reliable sources are actually a pretty fun thing to use. If we can call attention to the erroneous information used by the counter argument, then, well, we've done something good for ourselves. So keep those kinds of things in mind. If you want information to support your own argument, use reliable sources. If you're trying to disprove an argument, use unreliable sources. I want us now to look at an example of source evaluation using internet search. So let's search for a common subject. Let's go over migraine headaches. So we have a number of results here. So let's just start with the first one, the migrainemayoclinic.com. So on the Mayo Clinic's website, well, we can see a number of different things. One, the Mayo Clinic in and of itself is a reputable organization. They've been around for many years and have contributed a lot towards cancer research and other health issues. So the Mayo Clinic exists solely to provide information and help cure diseases. So they're a reputable organization and they're very well thought of in the medical community. So just based on that, we know the publisher has a good reputation. So we'll start looking at this little website here and just kind of see what's going on. A couple things we notice are some advertisements to the right and left of the page. So on the right we see an advertisement for a dress, I guess, and on the left we have this other one, connect with others who've been there. So we have really not so much an advertisement for a product, but an advertisement for a service that the Mayo Clinic already offers. So we think those are pretty safe kinds of advertisements. They're distinguishable from the rest of the source, and so that's kind of helpful. We even have a advertisement for a book, and that book was written by, we see, Martha Gordon, MD, medical editor. So there we go. So let's look at authorship. At the top of the page under definition, we see that this article was written by the Mayo Clinic staff, so there's no direct author given. But let's click on this link and see what this takes us to. Alright, so you see here, nice little brief introduction thing, but there's no real authors listed here, but we do have this list of medical editors. We see this at the top, so let's click on that and see where that takes us. Alright, so now what we're seeing here is a nice long list of names that are associated with particular general health problems. So let's look at the author's qualifications as we look along here. So the medical director, Roger Harms, has an MD. MD is a medical doctor, so Dr. Harms is a medical doctor. So we notice here MD, MD, MD. So we even have here someone who has a medical doctorate and a doctorate of philosophy, a PhD. So we see this throughout. There's some RNs, which is a registered nurse. So we have people who have direct experience in the medical field. So these are people who are highly educated and very likely highly experienced. So that's a good thing. So let's go back and look at some of the other things in relation to this article. So we're back at the main page for the migraine website. So let's look at a couple of different things. This article is broken up into a number of different categories, definitions, symptoms, causes, and so on. So let's go for treatment and drugs. So we see the definition of, or information about the treatment and drugs related to migraine headaches. So we see all this information here going through. That's all fine. Now, I bring you to this particular part because I want to show you something that happens here. Let's copy. Oops. Let's copy a piece of this article and take it back to Google. So now we're back at Google, so let's paste this definition into the search engine. So there's a couple of things to notice here. On the search engine, we see the very first result is from the Mayo Clinic, but let's look down a few things. Let's compare the Mayo Clinic one and the Patient's Medical definitions. We notice there's two different types of texts in black. There's standard and there's bolded. The bolded text just means that there have been exact matches. So as we scroll down through the rest of the page, well, all of these different definitions here were copied from somewhere. That's interesting. So let's take a look at this Patient's Medical website. So on the Patient's Medical website, we're noticing a couple of things. We have some advertisements on the side. Some are associated with this Patient's Medical kind of thing. But however, we're noticing a few things. The definition that we see under conventional treatment of migraine headaches is exactly the same definition as the one seen on the Mayo Clinic website. So if we scroll to the bottom, So if we scroll to the bottom of the web page, the only thing we'll notice is that there's no authorship information posted other than and only thing we see is this next step. While you may find the information useful, you should make an appointment to see one of our physicians to ensure that your health issues are properly addressed. To schedule an appointment with our physicians, call our patient coordinator at phone number and email address. We are located at Patient's Medical PC, 800 2nd Avenue, Suite 900, Manhattan, New York, New York. This is interesting because this particular doctor's office, Patient's Medical, has plagiarized the definition for migraine headaches from the Mayo Clinic website and is presenting it as if it's their own information. I don't know about you, but I don't think I would want to go to a doctor's office that plagiarizes. So let's look at some other examples of this. So back at Google, let's scroll down a little bit. Let's go to another page of answers or results. So we see a number of other things. Well, this is interesting here because we have a result that pops up from CNN.com. Let's look at that one. Now on the website, it may seem strange that CNN, which is supposed to be a reputable news agency, has seemingly plagiarized from the Mayo Clinic. Well, if you look at the fine print at the bottom here, well, we see that the Mayo Foundation for Medical Education and Research, well, there you go. So CNN has used the information, but they've given proper credit to the Mayo Clinic for being the author of that. So here we go. We notice this up here, featuring content from MayoClinic.com. They're giving due credit to the Mayo Clinic for producing this information. So that's good. So finally, source evaluation is really all about asking questions about your source. So skim through the PowerPoint associated with this again, and use this to help you determine what sources you want to use and what sources you don't want to use. Because remember, you don't want to use just any source that you find strewn about the internet. So, happy researching.